So welcome everyone to the pacing breakout session for today's tag meeting. Generally, the approach is to share any thoughts on what came out in the discussions with the full tag group today. I know I'm still digesting some of it, but we do have people who aren't usually able to join us here.
Michelle, would it make sense to go through kind of our feedback and digestion by section or topic of our comment?
Sure, and thank you for being organized, Haley. We're not expecting to have enough time for this breakout today. So I'm going to pull up the slides that we used as a good way to just focus us. So
Yeah, we could even talk about, just briefly go over what the main feedback, it sounded like, I think it was pretty straightforward until we got to the more complicated sections. I think the emission schedule and the carbon intensity values, the feedback was a lot more straightforward. So even if we got through those two, and that could be like solidified for next week, that would probably be a
agreed, agreed. So I'm not sure if folks can see this. I just have the four main topics there.
That's
Takeaway,
great. I can see it.
excellent. So I'll let other people speak first. Overall reactions and thoughts for us to make sure we include or add to what we're preparing for the feedback to Deirdre's team. So that
On the
starting with the emission schedule.
So
Go ahead, Matt. I was
Right.
going to jump to carbon
no,
intensity.
no, I just wanted to explain myself further because Emily asked me a question in the chat that I just realized that I didn't answer. Um, um, but I don't want to hijack this conversation. I just wanted to point out that my point earlier was to simply say there's a conflict that I think TJ Poor and I have said this a couple of times in maybe different ways that not everyone agrees with, and that's fine. But that the conflict in the legislation is that there's two different requests using two technically different data sets, or at least two data sets that aren't as easily compatible, which is the emissions reduction requirements and the carbon intensity values in the RCI sector, residential, commercial, industrial, and then the way we count the thermal fuels that we use today. They don't perfectly match up. And for some, that might be a minor inconvenience. It's something that we can just sham that round peg to that square hole. That's fine. But at least we have to acknowledge it. And if there is a solution, I think we should find it. Because you'll notice the conversation that took place, which is, well, are we counting cooking gallons or not? Well, if we are, okay, that's a different process than what we're doing right now. Are we counting non-thermal uses of fossil fuels in that pool of uses that's not transportation, it's not heating? Well, you could argue, and as Ken eloquently did, that RCI says yes, but you could also look at the statute and say no. And until that's resolved, either in legislation or in rule, I think there's going to be at the edges, at the margins, there's going to be conversations about whether we're not actually complying with a law that requires us to design a program that reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 40% from 1990 levels by the end of the decade.
Thank you, Matt. Shall we, if I'm not hearing any other comments, shall we jump down to the two topics where there were much more discussion? Where were you planning to begin, Haley?
I was actually on the carbon intensity side, and it's not necessarily my own. Yeah, I heard a lot of reference and discussion of California on this topic in our meeting, and so I was wondering if it would be worth our team's effort to yeah, I really don't know if this is helpful, but add a footnote to um, California, or like, I was just trying to figure out how this group reflects the feedback that Tag shared. Um, and it sounded like California has a different approach. And so do we need to add a footnote that says, we reviewed that material and, you know, if that means we modify our comment, we do, or if we don't, then we still say we reviewed that material. So I just wanted to put that out there because that to me seemed like the biggest piece of the discussion on this topic. Um,
I um I like that idea, Haley, and I had a note to myself to go in and look at their legislation to clarify how transportation fuels are incorporated into what they're doing, because the various discussions that's been coming out, it wasn't clear to me that they were broken out the way we are doing it here in Vermont, trying to look at only the thermal sector. So it sounds like there are several areas that would help for us to better put into context the California examples that continue to be appropriately cited to help guide us.
Yeah, and from what I heard, it sounded like the recommendation was to make sure that there's enough flexibility in the setting the carbon intensity so that um, the, the PUC can determine after. So it sounded like this initial step change for 5 years, there was general agreement that initially that's probably appropriate, but that maybe for the 2030 to 20 or 2031 to 2050, to make sure that there is flexibility built in for setting those carbon intensities for those 2019 years. And I just want to, when I look at and I need to look at this myself a little bit more, but because it's on or before January 1st, 2030, we have to do that. I think that there probably it's not a rulemaking process for setting those carbon intensity scores. So I can look into that to see, but I guess just for this subgroup's purpose, maybe like a footnote to say, for that next 2031 to 2050 time period, the subgroup recommends building in a level of flexibility so that the market can, it can both pace the carbon intensity of fuels appropriately to meet the goals, and also respond appropriately to the market or something like that, which is what at least I got out of that comment.
that resonates with me, Deirdre. Yeah.
And moving on to the discussions about the actual setting for the trajectories for the emissions reductions. Key thoughts that were new or added to the way we had been interpreting things.
So it sounds like that's step one, Matt, is where you think setting the baseline might be problematic. There's probably not agreement on the group there, right? So the proposal suggested using the latest inventory data because that's what this program is supposed to be tied to. The subgroup is tying it to the latest fuel tax data. And there were some reservations about that, correct?
Right. So yeah, you sort of have three different. There's the RCI data of greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't perfectly correlate with the fuels used for thermal, and then the fuel tax data is pretty close to perfect, but not quite yet until we go through a year of collecting the diet diesel data. But yeah, then we still have that outstanding question, which is what about non-thermal uses of propane, cooking and power generation? So how the tax data plus the registration data plus the RCI inventory, how they all talk to each other through Google Translate or whatever we create to transpose those. I think there's still, I don't know how to do it. I mean, I know there's a way, but I don't know how to do it right now. And if we just
Matt,
settle on, okay, let's just settle on, we have a number. It is the fuel tax data, because that is not, that's sold, that's 1 gallon counted once, as opposed to the registry data, which is the gallon counted as many times as it's sold from the point of import to the point of consumption. We use that data, and then we use the most recent data collected since July 1 of 2023, in which we know we break out the dyed diesel, and then we create some sort of simple algorithm that every propane provider can have, which illustrates what percentage of fuel is used for non-thermal purposes. So we can just apply that to it, that discount rate. That's what I would do, and then use the emissions based off that. But that is not what the law says. The law is looking at residential, commercial, industrial. That is a much larger pool of emissions than what we've got just heating water and heating air.
so Matt, sorry, another clarifying question. So is it your perspective that when obligated parties, or sorry, just people who are required to register with the commission, when they're reporting their sales data, that the non-thermal line item, there could be sales reference there that don't necessarily perfectly align with if we just took out the non-road diesel, basically, or off-road,
Oh,
transportation fuels.
Oh, the
Like,
alignment is far more
yeah.
complicated than that. The problem is that, or the benefit, you've got to track that gallon as it crosses into Vermont on a tanker truck or a rail car, because we don't have pipelines, we don't have sea terminals. And then every stop it makes along the way, you've got to track that gallon until its ultimate consumption. That's how the obligation is determined. So the universe of entities that sell fossil fuel in or into Vermont is smaller than the universe of entities that sell fossil fuel, heating oil, kerosene, dyed diesel, or excuse me, heating oil, kerosene, propane. So there's that challenge. The easier data set is the retail sale of heating oil, propane, because that's collected every month rather than once a year, by the tax department, and it splits out the dyed diesel use as of July 1 of 2023. So I mean, I can't, because that's private data, but I could see those numbers. If I saw the numbers side by side, I could sort of come to some conclusions. But until then, we still have that fundamental problem, which is, are we judging our progress? And are we creating a model to achieve the emission reduction mandates in the Global Warming Solutions Act based on the estimates created by the Department of Public Service of residential, commercial, industrial greenhouse gas emissions? Or are we doing it on the sale of fossil fuels for thermal purposes, as is collected by the registry and the tax department? Those are two different numbers.
As an informational piece, thank you, Matt. This is very helpful. Um, is it possible to share with us a copy of that registration form? I was trying to look it up, but I want to make sure
Yeah,
that we've got it just for the pacing groups for reference so that we understand what people are filling out.
yeah. The blank registration form is
Yes, the
publicly
blank
available,
form.
and it's online.
Okay, then I'll pull that up and share it
Yeah,
with the pacing subgroup.
sure.
Thanks. Then we went on. There were some good comments that came out about the trajectories, and Brian had an excellent discussion about item number 5 on what's showing as far as how the trajectories will evolve. Any other thoughts that we need to make sure we capture today from either this or the obligated party requirements? I feel like the fundamentals are still where we are getting hung up. The overall process makes sense logically, but it's those starting points. And it was helpful to me to hear more from Opinion Dynamics on what's been clarified for their deliverables and what's still evolving there as well.
In terms of just getting this into something that I guess either incorporates or acknowledges feedback that the subgroup does or doesn't agree with putting in the final recommendation for the full group. I am hoping people send written feedback because there was some, I think Brian Woods had a comment about maybe adding in a measure mix step into this. And I didn't quite follow if that was the recommendation, or so anyway, just trying to think forward to next Thursday, to help this group kind of where they want to take the feedback and incorporate it and where they want to acknowledge but not incorporate it, and make sure everyone was on the same page on the kind of feedback that they got, because hopefully that'll be coming in written comments, or I mean we have the video recording, but some of it was hard to digest in real time. So
I agree. To your point, Deirdre, I've got notes including that section from Brian to go back to the recording and better capture the details of what was coming out.
Okay. Well, it is 12:25, so I'm assuming Catherine will call us back soon. But so nothing more from me anyway.
More me. Oh, and they're calling us.